A millionaire found a fainted girl at his door and decided to let her in. When he returned from a business trip, he couldn't believe what she had done with his disabled mother. The roar of the winter storm engulfed the Salazar mansion like a chaotic symphony of wind and rain. The imposing structure, located on the outskirts of the city, seemed to defy the raging weather, though it couldn't silence the creaks echoing from the branches of the old nearby trees. The rain hammered against the windows with relentless force, as if trying to break through to the inside. In one of the mansion's rooms, Isabella Salazar listened to the clamor from her wheelchair. It was another night in her monotonous existence, marked by silence and the echoes of melodies she once played on her piano, now covered in dust. Memories of her youth and a life that felt distant enveloped her with a mix of melancholy and resignation. Outside, the darkness seemed infinite, and the howling wind only heightened the sense of loneliness within her soul. Miles away, Charles Salazar struggled to keep his sports car under control in the middle of the storm. He was returning from a business meeting that hadn't gone as planned, his mind preoccupied with the usual concerns: the demands of his hotel empire, the constant pressure of business decisions, and the emotional weight of caring for his mother, who had retreated into her own world after a devastating accident. Each mile brought him closer to the mansion, but also intensified the heaviness in his chest. As he turned onto the long driveway leading to the main entrance, the headlights of his car illuminated something unexpected. Charles slammed the brakes, and the car screeched to a halt amidst the puddles. In front of the mansion's towering iron gates, a small figure lay motionless on the soaked stone ground, unmoving under the rain. With his heart pounding, Charles stepped out of the car and braved the storm. The figure turned out to be a girl of about 10 years old. She was barefoot, wearing worn and dirty clothes that offered no protection against the winter cold. Her pale face and bluish lips reflected exhaustion and extreme cold. Around her neck, a locket dangled, glinting faintly under the car's headlights. Charles bent down to observe her more closely, torn between caution and an impulse he couldn't quite identify. "Who are you?" he murmured, though he knew there would be no answer. The girl showed no signs of consciousness. His instincts screamed at him not to get involved. Calling the authorities and leaving it to them seemed the logical choice. Yet something about the vulnerable expression on the girl's face disarmed him. Perhaps it was the fact that, despite his outward strength, he himself knew what it felt like to be lost and helpless. With a resigned sigh, Charles picked her up in his arms. She was as light as a feather, and her skin was icy to the touch. Rushing toward the mansion, he crossed the grand doors, where Marta, the family nurse, met him with a mix of surprise and alarm. "What's going on, Mr. Salazar?" Marta asked, as Charles laid the girl on the nearest sofa. "She needs help. She was unconscious at the front gate," he replied, his tone leaving no room for further questions. Marta, ever efficient, hurried to fetch blankets and began examining the girl. Meanwhile, from her window, Isabella observed the unusual commotion at the mansion's entrance. Though the rain distorted her view, she could make out the figure of her son carrying something. Curiosity overtook her, and a spark of intrigue crossed her mind. What could possibly be happening on such a strange night? Inside the Salazar mansion, that stormy night would mark the beginning of a change none of its inhabitants could foresee. Outside, the wind kept roaring, but inside, a spark of destiny had begun to ignite. Marta moved swiftly, as always, to make the girl comfortable. She brought her to the sofa near the mansion's large fireplace, where the flames crackled with a comforting warmth that contrasted with the cold emanating from the child. She pulled a stack of blankets from the nearest cabinet and carefully wrapped them around the small figure, ensuring she was well covered to regain warmth. The nurse leaned in to examine her more closely. Though the girl was pale and clearly malnourished, she didn't appear to have any visible injuries. Her breathing was shallow but steady, and the fire's heat seemed to bring a faint flush to her cheeks. Marta sighed with relief, realizing there were no serious physical injuries. "How is she?" Charles asked from the doorway to the room, where he stood with an expression of concern and unease. He had chosen to stay back, letting Marta handle the situation as he tried to process what had happened. "Weak, but I think she'll be fine. She just needs rest, some food, and warmth," Marta replied as she adjusted the blankets. From the hallway, Isabella, intrigued by the unusual commotion, called out to the nurse. "Marta, come here for a moment," she said, with a tone that combined authority and curiosity. Marta, after ensuring the girl was comfortable, headed to Isabella's room. Upon arrival, she noticed the inquisitive look in the woman's eyes, who had been listening attentively from her room. "What's happening? What's all this commotion?" Isabella asked. Marta, trying to explain what little she knew, summarized briefly. "It's a girl, Mrs. Salazar. Mr. Charles found her unconscious at the gate during the storm. She seems to have gone a long time without proper food or shelter." Isabella's eyes narrowed, her mind filling with questions. A girl, alone, barefoot and weak, in the middle of a storm. Intrigue grew within her, mixed with a sense of unease she couldn't define. Meanwhile, Charles remained in the living room, watching the girl from a cautious distance. His rigid posture reflected an attempt to remain detached, but his mind was already working on possible next steps. "We can call the authorities in the morning. This isn't our concern," he said coldly, when Marta returned. His tone was practical, almost distant, as if trying to maintain a barrier between himself and the situation. However, Isabella, upon hearing the suggestion, quickly intervened. "Call the authorities. What kind of solution is that?" she said firmly from her room, her voice reaching the main living area. "That girl needs a place to recover. We can't leave her stranded after all she's been through." Charles turned to his mother, surprised by the sharpness in her tone. "Mum, we don't know who she is. It could be dangerous to get involved," he replied, though his words lacked true conviction. "She's a child, Charles," Isabella responded, her gaze leaving no room for argument. "And if she ended up here, in the middle of this storm, she clearly needs help. She should stay until she recovers." Isabella's words hung in the air, leaving little room for debate. Charles, though still reluctant, couldn't find enough arguments to contradict her. Finally, with a sigh of resignation, he conceded. "Fine, she can stay, for now." Throughout the remainder of the night, Marta stayed by the girl's side, watching every small change in her condition. She placed her on an improvised mattress near the fireplace and prepared some hot tea for when she woke up. Isabella, from her room, couldn't sleep. Her mind wandered into buried memories, while a hint of curiosity began to stir in her hardened heart. Who was this little one, and what circumstances had led her to the doorstep of their home? Meanwhile, Charles spent the hours trying to work in his study, but his concentration slipped away time and again. The image of the girl in the rain, the locket gleaming faintly, kept resurfacing in his mind, provoking a restlessness he couldn't explain. Each time he tried to reason it out, the same question inevitably arose. Who was this girl? And what was she doing in front of his mansion in the middle of a storm? The storm still raged outside, but inside the Salazar mansion, fate had begun to map out a new path for all who lived there. The storm that had roared throughout the night dissipated at dawn, leaving behind a clear sky as the first rays of sun lit up the Salazar mansion. The windows reflected the warm morning light, while the timid singing of birds began to fill the air. Inside the house, calm felt fragile, as though every corner was on edge, awaiting whatever might come next. In the main hall, the girl began to stir beneath the blankets Marta had so carefully arranged. With a soft whimper, Lucia slowly opened her eyes, blinking at the gentle light filtering through the enormous windows. Her gaze, full of confusion and fear, swept over the unfamiliar surroundings. The imposing walls, the elegant furniture, and the crackling fireplace seemed foreign to any place she had ever known. Marta, who had been seated nearby all night, noticed the movement and approached with a kind smile. "Hello, sweetheart," she said in a soft voice meant to reassure her. "You're safe. You don't have to worry." Lucia did not reply immediately. Her eyes searched for something familiar in a place where nothing was. Sensing the girl's nervousness, Marta went to the kitchen and returned with a bowl of hot soup. She offered it as she sat down next to her. "Have a little. It will make you feel better." At first, the girl hesitated, watching Marta warily. But the warm, comforting aroma of the soup seemed to convince her, and with slow, timid movements, she took the spoon. Each spoonful seemed to relax her a bit more, and though she said nothing, the nurse noticed the tension in her shoulders beginning to fade. When she finished eating, Lucia set the bowl aside, and driven by a curiosity that seemed stronger than her fear, stood up from the sofa. Marta watched as she cautiously wandered through the hall, taking in every corner with her eyes. Eventually, her attention settled on the imposing piano that dominated the room, an instrument that had remained silent for years. The girl approached it slowly, as though afraid of disturbing something sacred. Her small, slender fingers pressed lightly on the keys, producing a few erratic sounds at first, like a random interplay of tones with no direction. But soon, her movements grew more sure. With surprising ease, Lucia began to play a simple yet profoundly evocative melody. From a nearby corridor, Isabella heard the first notes and froze in her wheelchair. That melody, that set of notes, was unmistakable. It was one of Carolina's favorite pieces, her lost daughter. Her heart, hardened by years of sorrow, seemed to stop for an instant. "Where did you learn that?" Isabella asked, her voice barely a whisper that managed to emerge from her dry throat. Lucia turned, somewhat startled to realize she had company. "I don't know," she answered honestly, her eyes showing a hint of confusion. "I think someone used to play it, but I can't remember who." The vague response was enough to stir something within Isabella. A mixture of hope and pain welled up inside her. How was it possible that this girl, a stranger who had appeared at her door, could play something so intimately connected to her daughter? The memory of Carolina, who had left such a deep emptiness in her life, surfaced unexpectedly and overwhelmingly. From the hall's entrance, Charles watched the scene in silence. He stood with his arms crossed, remaining in the shadows, studying the girl with cold, calculating eyes. Though he didn't share the emotional bond his mother felt, he could not ignore the strangeness of the situation. The coincidence seemed too great, and with each passing moment, his suspicion of Lucia grew. After a long silence, Charles decided to act. He approached Marta while Isabella remained immersed in her thoughts. "We need to know more about her," he said quietly, so only Marta could hear. "Find out everything you can. Her name, where she's from, anything. I don't want any surprises." Marta nodded, though her expression reflected slight concern. She knew Charles did not trust easily, but something about Lucia's fragile state made her doubt the girl could have any bad intentions. As for Charles, he returned to his study, determined to focus on his work. However, the melody still echoed in his mind, and every time he tried to concentrate, the image of the girl by the piano reappeared. It was an inexplicable unease, as though Lucia's presence had stirred something long buried inside him. As the day advanced, the Salazar mansion filled with a different atmosphere, loaded with unanswered questions and long-repressed emotions. Lucia's arrival had begun to set off a chain of events that none of its inhabitants could have foreseen. The following days passed in a cycle of tensions and small revelations. Lucia's presence in the Salazar mansion became a constant, one that seemed to disrupt everyone's routine. Although the girl behaved with impeccable manners, her natural curiosity drove her to explore every corner of the house, eliciting varied reactions from its residents. Jacob, the butler, was the first to show his displeasure. During one of his rounds, he found Lucia in the mansion's private wing, an area kept closed to all but the family. The girl stood before a wall, lined with family portraits, examining them closely. Her eyes lingered especially on a portrait of Carolina, Isabella's lost daughter, and something in her expression caught Jacob's attention. It was a mix of recognition and confusion, as if she were trying to recall something just beyond her reach. "You have no permission to be here," Jacob said brusquely, interrupting the moment. His tone was harsher than necessary, and his rigid bearing seemed to intimidate Lucia. "I'm sorry," she replied softly, lowering her gaze. She stepped back, but not before pointing to Carolina's portrait. "Who is she?" she asked, with an innocence that unsettled Jacob. "That's none of your business," the butler retorted, feeling deeply uncomfortable with the girl's presence. Without another word, he escorted her out of the private wing, leaving behind a tension that seemed to cling to the air. Marta, ever the mediator, tried to calm things down after the incident. Finding Lucia sitting in the kitchen, her eyes still filled with unease, she sat beside her and offered a glass of warm milk. "Jacob can be a bit harsh sometimes, but don't take it personally," she said with a reassuring smile. Lucia nodded, though she didn't say much. Her silence spoke louder than any words. Marta noticed that the girl seemed to be searching for something, not only with her eyes, but in every movement she made. It was as if she were trying to fit together the pieces of an invisible puzzle, one no one else could see. Meanwhile, Charles announced that he had to be away for a few days on an unavoidable business trip. Before leaving, he gathered Marta and Jacob in his study. "I want you to keep an eye on that girl," he said with his usual authoritative tone. "I don't know who she is or what she wants, but I need answers when I return. Make sure she doesn't cause any trouble." Jacob, always ready to follow orders, nodded firmly. Marta, however, felt uneasy about the task. Though she understood Charles's concerns, something about Lucia inspired empathy, not suspicion. Still, she kept her reservations to herself, knowing that Charles wouldn't tolerate disagreements. With Charles gone, the mansion's dynamics changed. Isabella, who in recent days had shown growing interest in Lucia, began defending her more fervently. "She's just a child," she would say, whenever Jacob complained about the girl's curiosity. "If she's here, it's for a reason. We can't treat her like some intruder." This attitude from Isabella only heightened Jacob's frustration, as he felt the girl's presence disrupted the order and tranquility of the house. Marta, for her part, found herself caught between the two. While trying to maintain the peace, she couldn't help feeling intrigued by the locket Lucia wore around her neck. It was a delicate, old piece, clearly significant, though the girl never spoke of it. One night, as Marta combed through some mansion archives, searching for clues about Lucia's possible connection to the family, she found an old photograph of Carolina wearing an identical locket. The coincidence chilled her. Although she didn't want to jump to conclusions, she began to suspect that the child might be more closely tied to the Salazars than anyone imagined. Meanwhile, Lucia continued exploring the house with a blend of wonder and inexplicable familiarity. She never said it aloud, but certain corners and objects seemed familiar, as if they belonged to a memory buried deep within her mind. The paintings, the antique furniture, even the scent of certain rooms evoked a connection she couldn't understand. It was as if Lucia's presence had awakened something in the mansion, an energy that had lain dormant for years. Though no one could explain it, everyone was beginning to feel it. The girl wasn't merely a temporary guest. She was a catalyst who, without knowing it, had begun moving the pieces of the past, preparing the ground for revelations that would change the Salazar family's life forever. The morning light filtered softly through the mansion's large windows, bathing the main hall in a golden glow that contrasted with the stillness of the place. Isabella, seated in her wheelchair, contemplated the piano from her usual spot. For years, she had avoided even looking at it, as if the instrument were a reminder too painful of times when her hands could still play and her heart could still feel whole. But something had changed since Lucia's arrival. The girl, with her calm energy and innate curiosity, sat before the piano. Her small fingers drifted clumsily over the keys, producing scattered, disordered notes. Though it wasn't proper music, There was something enchanting in her experimentation, a blend of innocence and exploration that filled the hall with unexpected warmth. "Do you want to learn?" Isabella's voice broke the silence. The question seemed to emerge from deep within her, surprising even herself. Lucia turned quickly to Isabella, eyes wide. "Would you teach me?" she asked, her tone mixing shyness with hope. Isabella nodded, allowing a slight smile. "If you want to learn, of course." And so began an unexpected routine. Over the following days, Isabella and Lucia spent long hours together at the piano. At first, the lessons were simple: how to position the hands, how to distinguish the keys, and a few basic chords. But what started as a teaching activity soon turned into something far deeper. Isabella, who had spent years emotionally isolated, began to feel a spark of vitality she hadn't experienced in a long time. Lucia's joy with each small improvement was contagious, and every time the girl managed to play a simple melody, Isabella felt something within her own heart begin to heal. "You're a fast learner," Isabella said one afternoon as Lucia practiced a scale. "If you keep this up, you'll soon play better than I ever did." Lucia laughed shyly, but didn't stop focusing on the keyboard. "I don't think I could ever play as beautifully as you," she replied. Although her words were humble, there was a determination in her gaze that Isabella could not ignore. However, in the midst of those shared sessions, Isabella couldn't help noticing that Lucia avoided talking about herself. When she tried to inquire about her family or her past, the girl always found a way to shift the topic. "I don't remember well," she would often say, or she would steer the conversation toward questions about the songs or Isabella's stories. Far from frustrating her, this made Isabella feel a deep protective instinct toward the girl. It was clear Lucia carried something she wasn't ready to share, and though Isabella didn't know exactly what that was, she was determined to give her the space and safety she needed. Meanwhile, Marta watched this transformation in Isabella with amazement. The woman who had once spent entire days in silence, immersed in her own sorrow, now spoke enthusiastically and involved herself actively in the mansion's life. There was something rejuvenating in the relationship between Isabella and Lucia, a connection Marta couldn't fully explain but deeply appreciated. Yet along with her astonishment came unease. Marta could not ignore the feeling that Lucia harbored secrets. There was something in the way the girl looked at the piano, the walls, even the mansion's hallways, as if she were recognizing pieces of a puzzle only she understood. Marta recalled the locket Lucia always wore, an object seemingly as important to the child as her own life. What story did that little pendant hide? And why did Lucia's arrival seem to have awakened long-forgotten memories in Isabella? Though the answers weren't clear, one thing was certain. Lucia's presence had changed the mansion's dynamic. The shadows of the past seemed less threatening, replaced by a sense of renewal and hope that began to seep into the hearts of its inhabitants. But deep down, everyone knew that secrets could not remain hidden forever, and when they finally emerged, they would do so in a way that would transform the Salazar family's life forever. The afternoon passed with unusual serenity at the Salazar mansion. In the main hall, Isabella and Lucia practiced a new melody on the piano. The chords filled the air with a gentle softness that seemed to illuminate the house's darkest corners. Isabella patiently corrected Lucia's mistakes, and the girl responded with a concentration that revealed her desire to learn. Meanwhile, in the room Lucia temporarily occupied, Marta took advantage of the moment to do a thorough cleaning. Although the girl owned few belongings, the small space had been imbued with the warmth of her presence. Marta carefully organized Lucia's clothing and personal items, taking care not to invade her privacy. But when she reached the nightstand to dust it, something caught her attention. On the nightstand rested Lucia's locket, the same one the girl wore around her neck most of the time. Marta paused, observing it with curiosity. It was a delicate old piece, its intricate design suggesting great sentimental value. For days, Marta had noticed how Lucia seemed to guard it fiercely, as if the tiny pendant were her anchor in a world full of uncertainty. Cautiously, not wanting to betray the child's trust, Marta picked up the locket. Its light weight and the smooth, worn metal made her wonder what story it held. Finally, after a moment of hesitation, she gently opened it. Inside, she found a tiny, time-worn photograph. The face of a young woman, smiling and brimming with life, gazed back from within the locket. Marta felt the air leave her lungs. It was a face she would recognize anywhere. Carolina, Isabella's long-lost daughter. Marta's hands trembled as she held the locket. Her mind began connecting the pieces of a puzzle that had seemed impossible until now. Could this girl be Carolina's daughter? The possibility was as astonishing as it was unsettling. If Lucia was connected to the family, why had she never mentioned anything? How had she ended up on the mansion's doorstep that stormy night? Marta carefully closed the locket and placed it back on the nightstand. For several minutes, she remained still, trying to process what she had discovered. The idea deeply disturbed her, not just because of what it might mean for Isabella, but also for what it implied about the girl. If Lucia truly was part of the Salazar family, what kind of life had she led until now? And why had she ended up alone and helpless? That night, when the rest of the household seemed to have surrendered to sleep, Marta decided to act. She knew she couldn't share her suspicions with Isabella right away. The emotional impact could be devastating to her recovery. But she also couldn't ignore what she had seen. She needed proof, something more than intuition and a faded photograph. Marta headed to the mansion's archive, a room holding decades of family history. Under the dim light of a lamp, she began sifting through boxes filled with documents, letters, and old photographs. After hours of searching, she found what she'd been looking for, a series of photos of a young Carolina. She compared one of the images to Lucia's face, memorizing every detail. The resemblances were undeniable. The shape of her eyes, the curve of her smile, even certain gestures Marta had noticed in the girl, seemed to reflect Carolina. The discovery filled Marta with a mixture of awe and worry. If her suspicions were correct, Isabella had a granddaughter living under her roof, and no one knew it. Marta promised herself she would investigate further before revealing the truth. She knew she was walking on fragile ground, and one wrong move could forever alter the mansion's delicate dynamics. As she carefully put the documents away, a thought crossed her mind. Lucia had not come to this house by chance. Her presence was part of something larger, something yet to be uncovered. Several miles away from the imposing Salazar mansion, in a cramped, dingy apartment in a rundown neighborhood, Rodrigo leaned over a table covered with documents, newspaper clippings, and worn photographs. The light from a single bare bulb hung from the ceiling, casting irregular shadows over his face, weathered by years and excess. His dark, calculating eyes scanned each piece of paper with a mix of anxiety and obsession. In front of him, a yellowed newspaper clipping stood out amid the clutter. "Girl missing after escape from orphanage," the headline read. In the faded photo, Lucia's young face was clearly visible. Rodrigo picked up the clipping, examined it for the umpteenth time, and then let it drop onto the table with a grunt. "Where are you, Lucia?" he muttered to himself, taking a long swig of cheap liquor. "You can't hide forever." His desperation was not chaotic. It was the product of a methodical, manipulative mind. Though his life had been a series of bad decisions and vices, Rodrigo had always been adept at finding opportunities, and Lucia represented the greatest one of all. But it wasn't love driving him, nor genuine interest in the girl's well-being. It was ambition, pure and simple. Lucia was his ticket into the world of the Salazars, a family he had always despised and envied in equal measure. A leap into the past revealed the truth of Rodrigo's connection to the Salazars. Years ago, Rodrigo had met Carolina, a brilliant yet emotionally fragile young woman looking to escape the tensions and expectations of her family. With his charm and smooth words, Rodrigo managed to seduce her, presenting himself as someone who understood her and offered a way out of her oppressive world. Carolina, captivated by the promise of freedom, ran away with him. But what began as a romantic relationship quickly turned dark. Rodrigo showed his true colors, controlling, manipulative, and eventually abusive. Carolina, trapped and far from her family, had nowhere to turn. The arrival of Lucia, their daughter, became the only ray of light in her life, but also the beginning of her decline. Physically and emotionally drained, Carolina died shortly after giving birth, leaving Lucia in Rodrigo's hands. Unwilling and incapable of raising the child, Rodrigo left her at an orphanage, seeing her as a problem he couldn't afford. For years, he ignored her existence, until recently, when he heard rumors about her escape from the orphanage. Then Rodrigo began to inquire, driven by a mixture of curiosity and the idea of using Lucia to gain something from the powerful Salazar family. Back in the present, Rodrigo lit a cigarette, letting the smoke fill the stale apartment air as he organized his thoughts. On the table lay a list of names and addresses, each connected to the Salazars in some way. Photographs of the mansion, taken from a prudent distance, were marked with notes, side entrances, possible security blind spots, escape routes. He knew that approaching directly would be too risky. The Salazars were wealthy, influential, and likely very cautious. He needed to be clever, move carefully, and ensure that when he showed up, it would be from a position of total control. Rodrigo took a city map and circled the mansion's location. "There you are," he murmured with a twisted smile, "and soon I'll be there too." In the days that followed, Rodrigo intensified his search. He had gathered enough information to confirm that Lucia was indeed at the mansion, and that only fueled his determination. To him, the girl was nothing but a tool, a means to his ultimate goal, to blackmail the Salazars and secure a life of luxury he felt had always been denied him. The threat Rodrigo posed was latent yet growing. Each step he took brought him closer to the mansion, and his manipulative nature combined with his desperation made him a formidable enemy. Meanwhile, Lucia and the Salazars remained ignorant of the danger looming over them, unaware of the storm Rodrigo was preparing in the shadows. The afternoon passed with a rare serenity at the Salazar mansion. Sunlight filtered through the curtains of the main hall, casting golden patterns on the walls. Isabella, seated in her wheelchair, looked out toward the garden, where Lucia and Marta spent time gathering wildflowers growing at the edges of the perfectly manicured lawn. Though Isabella enjoyed these moments of calm, she couldn't help but feel a slight emptiness in her heart. She missed Lucia's laughter, her clear voice, and the spark she brought with her. Determined to make the most of her time, Isabella moved to the corner where she kept her old sheet music, a box that had remained forgotten for years. With slow but steady movements, she lifted the lid and began leafing through the yellowed pages. Each score was a reminder of happier times when her life revolved around music and her daughter Carolina filled the house with her laughter and songs. Among the scores, Isabella found one that took her breath away. It was a composition she hadn't played in decades, a special song that Carolina had performed countless times as a child. The melody, gentle and melancholic, was a secret they had shared, a piece she'd never taught anyone else. With eyes misty from recollection, Isabella held the sheet music against her chest for a moment before placing it atop the piano. She decided that this would be the next piece she taught Lucia. There was something about the girl that made sharing that song feel right, although she couldn't explain why. Later, as she rested in the parlor, Isabella heard a sound that made her pause. A soft voice was humming a melody out in the garden. At first, she thought it was her imagination, an echo of memories resurfacing after finding that sheet music. But as she paid closer attention, she realized the melody was real and familiar. She turned toward the window, her heart pounding. It was the same song, the one only Carolina knew. From her vantage point, she could see Lucia, who was picking flowers under Marta's supervision, humming with carefree innocence. The girl was engrossed in her task, as if the melody were something completely natural to her. Isabella felt overwhelmed by a surge of emotions, surprise, nostalgia, and something she couldn't quite define, but which resembled hope. How could Lucia know that song? It was impossible. No one else knew of its existence. When Lucia returned inside with a bundle of wildflowers, Isabella struggled to remain composed. She waited until Marta stepped out, wanting to speak to the girl alone. "Lucia," she began, trying to maintain a neutral tone, though her voice trembled slightly. "That song you were humming in the garden, where do you know it from?" Lucia, eyes wide, seemed surprised by the question. She lowered her gaze, somewhat embarrassed. "I don't really know," she admitted, fiddling with the petals of one of the flowers she carried. "Someone used to sing it to me when I was little, but I don't remember who." The answer, though vague, left Isabella with more questions than answers. Lucia didn't seem to be lying, but her explanation only heightened the mystery. Isabella wanted to press further, but feared pushing too hard, so she decided to drop the subject for now. That night, while the house sank into silence, Isabella lay awake, thinking. In the dimness of her room, she let her mind connect the pieces she had been avoiding. It wasn't just the song. Something about Lucia, her way of laughing, certain gestures, even her love of music, reminded her so deeply of Carolina. Could it be possible? The thought that Lucia might be connected to her lost daughter was as hopeful as it was terrifying. Isabella knew that clinging to that possibility could be dangerous for her heart, yet she couldn't ignore the parallels. Everything seemed to fit too neatly to be mere coincidence. Though she shared her suspicions with no one, the possibility began to take root in her mind. If there was any truth to her intuition, then Lucia had not come to the mansion by accident. Her presence could be a second chance, a way to redeem a past filled with pain. That night, while the rest of the house slept, Isabella, for the first time in a long while, allowed herself to dream. She dreamed of Carolina, her laughter, her music, and the connection they had shared. And in those dreams, a small figure with Lucia's face appeared, weaving together the threads of a story yet to be revealed. The Salazar mansion was immersed in a peculiar silence that afternoon. Marta and Jacob were busy with their respective tasks, ensuring everything was in order, and Charles was still away on his business trip. With the house mostly empty and no one watching her movements, Lucia felt a surge of curiosity, urging her to explore beyond the rooms and corridors she already knew. She slowly climbed a narrow wooden staircase leading to the oldest wing of the house, a section that seemed to have been forgotten over time. The door of a small study, left slightly ajar, caught her attention. Lucia pushed it gently and stepped inside. The place was filled with dusty furniture, shelves laden with aging books, and an atmosphere thick with untold stories. Particles of dust floated in the air, illuminated by rays of sunlight filtering through the heavy, faded curtains. There was something both cozy and mysterious about the study, as if every object safeguarded a secret waiting to be discovered. As she carefully examined the scattered belongings, her gaze fell upon a pile of old papers. Beneath them, she found a small wooden box that had been delicately closed, as if someone had placed it there intentionally. Guided by her instinct, Lucia set the papers aside and opened the box with care. Inside, she found an unexpected emotional treasure. They were letters, dozens of them, neatly stacked and tied with a faded ribbon. Each was addressed to Isabella Salazar, and all were signed by the same name, Carolina. The dates on the letters spanned several years, beginning shortly after Carolina's departure and extending until a few years prior. Lucia picked up the first letter from the pile, her heart pounding. With trembling hands, she unfolded the yellowed paper and read the first lines. "Mom, I know you don't want to hear from me, but please listen to my truth. Not everything that happened was as you imagined. Though I am far away, I always think of you." Lucia felt a lump in her throat as she continued reading. Carolina's words conveyed a mixture of regret, love, and a desperate need to be heard. Though Lucia didn't fully understand the magnitude of her discovery, something in those letters resonated deeply within her. There was a clear link between these words and the woman she vaguely remembered as her mother. She ran her hands over the remaining letters, resisting the urge to read them all at once. Each one seemed to contain fragments of a story she didn't yet understand, but felt destined to uncover. Why had these letters never reached Isabella? Had they been intentionally hidden or simply forgotten over time? And most importantly, what did they say about Carolina and her connection to this house? Lucia closed the box carefully and put it back beneath the pile of papers, making sure to leave everything as she had found it. Her mind was filled with questions. Should she share this discovery with Isabella? With Marta? Something inside her said these letters were important, not only for her, but for everyone in the mansion. That night, as she tried to sleep, the words of the letter echoed in her mind. Though she hadn't said it aloud, she began to suspect that her presence in the mansion was no coincidence. Each day, she seemed to uncover new pieces of a puzzle she couldn't yet assemble, but which was beginning to reveal a pattern. Her mother, the mansion, and the Salazars were connected in a way she could not ignore. Lucia promised herself she would return to read the letters when she was alone. She knew they contained answers, though she wasn't sure she was ready to face them yet. One thing was clear. Her arrival at this house was the start of something bigger, something that had been waiting to be unveiled for years. Night had fallen over the Salazar mansion, and a profound silence enveloped every corner of the house. Yet inside the family archive, Marta worked with firm but trembling hands, driven by a mix of curiosity and apprehension. The photograph inside Lucia's locket had never left her mind. There was something about that image, something that connected too many loose ends. She needed answers. With a desk lamp as her only source of light, Marta meticulously combed through boxes of documents, family albums, and forgotten records. She had worked in the mansion for years, but never before had she felt compelled to explore the Salazars' deepest secrets. This time, however, she felt she must. Finally, after hours of searching, she found what she was looking for, an old but perfectly legible official record. Marta read the heading, Birth Certificate. Her gaze dropped lower, and upon finding the mother's name, her heart skipped a beat. Carolina Salazar. The father's name was blank, but it wasn't necessary. Marta knew what this document meant. Lucia was no ordinary child. She was Carolina's daughter, Isabella's long-lost granddaughter, and Charles's niece. The air seemed heavier as the truth settled in her mind. Marta set the certificate on the table and sank into a nearby chair, unable to take her eyes off the paper. A wave of emotions washed over her, astonishment, relief, and an uncontrollable fear. Everything fit now. Lucia's gestures, her inexplicable connection to music, even her reaction upon seeing the family portraits, none of it was coincidence. It never had been. However, with this revelation came an overwhelming emotional burden. Marta knew that while Isabella was more animated since Lucia's arrival, she remained fragile. The decades of pain and regret over losing Carolina would not disappear easily. If this truth came out too abruptly, it could devastate her. Charles, on the other hand, posed a different challenge. His relationship with his mother and sister was marked by complex feelings of guilt and resentment. Charles had always borne the responsibility of being the family's pillar, and Carolina's departure had left a wound that never fully healed. Marta could not predict how he would react upon learning that his sister had had a daughter who had been right under his nose this entire time. Aware of how delicate the situation was, Marta made a difficult decision. She could not share this information immediately. She needed to wait for the right moment, a time when Isabella and Charles were prepared to face the truth. But this decision did not free her from the weight of the secret. On the contrary, every minute without revealing what she knew made the burden more unbearable. Marta placed the certificate in a folder and closed it carefully, returning it to the archive. She locked the door before heading back to her room, but the document remained etched in her mind. Lucia was more than a lost child. She was a piece of the family the Salazars had believed gone forever. That night, as she lay in bed, Marta found no rest. Her mind was filled with questions. Why had Lucia ended up in an orphanage? What had really happened to Carolina? And how would this revelation affect Isabella and Charles? Deep down, Marta knew she could not keep this secret forever. But until the right moment arrived, she would have to bear the truth alone, facing the weight of a past that was about to change the Salazar family's present forever. Let's consider a flashback that sheds light on the dark years Carolina spent with Rodrigo. Carolina, then a young idealist with a free spirit, was seeking to escape the tensions of her family life. Though her mother, Isabella, adored her, the expectations and weight of being a Salazar made her feel misunderstood and trapped. It was in that moment of vulnerability that Rodrigo appeared in her life. Rodrigo was charismatic, a man who knew exactly what Carolina needed to hear. At their first meeting, he flattered her, praising her talent and beauty in a way no one else ever had. He spoke of freedom, adventure, and a love without conditions. Carolina, starved for emotional connection, fell under his spell. He promised her a future together, far from the constraints of her family. "They will never understand who you truly are, Carolina," he would say, playing on the insecurities she struggled to hide. Soon after, Rodrigo convinced Carolina to run away with him. She left behind the comfort of the Salazar mansion and her family, believing Rodrigo's promises would lead her to happiness. At first, everything seemed perfect. Spontaneous trips, nights under the stars, and words full of love. But the illusion didn't last long. Over time, Rodrigo's true nature emerged. His behavior began to change, revealing a controlling, violent character. At first it was small things, comments about how she should dress or whom she should avoid. Then it grew deeper. Rodrigo began to isolate her, cutting her off from any possible support network. Carolina, more alone with each passing day, realized she was trapped in a toxic relationship. Good days became fewer and fewer, and dark moments dominated her life. Yet, amid the chaos, Lucia arrived, the only ray of hope for Carolina. The birth of her daughter gave her a reason to carry on, a purpose that helped her endure Rodrigo's constant abuse. Carolina protected Lucia with every ounce of strength she had, even as her own health began to deteriorate. Years of stress and emotional and physical maltreatment took their toll. In her final days, Carolina, weak and exhausted, begged Rodrigo to take care of Lucia. "She's not to blame for anything," she said, her voice barely audible. "Promise me you'll protect her." Rodrigo, with a mix of resentment and apathy, agreed, but he never intended to keep that promise. After Carolina's death, he left Lucia at an orphanage, viewing her as a burden he couldn't handle. Still, deep down, Rodrigo knew Lucia could be a valuable card in the future, a tool for gaining what he had always desired, money and revenge against the Salazars. Back in the present, Rodrigo sat in his cramped, gloomy apartment with a city map spread out on the table. He had circled the location of the Salazar mansion, and beside it were scattered notes detailing its occupants. Among them were blurry photographs of Lucia, probably taken by someone working for him. His obsession with the girl went beyond any paternal relationship. She represented the opportunity to get even with the family that, in his view, was responsible for Carolina's failures and, by extension, his own. Rodrigo took a long swig of cheap liquor and looked at the map with a crooked smile. "There you are, little one," he murmured. "And when they find out who you are, they'll know they can't hide from me." The Salazar mansion was his next target. Rodrigo did not see Lucia as a daughter, but as a key to unlock the doors to the Salazar's fortune. His plan was clear: to blackmail Isabella and Charles with the truth, using Lucia as a tool to manipulate them and profit from a family he had always despised. As Rodrigo's face remained grim under the dim light of his apartment, the threat he posed grew more imminent. His determination, fueled by years of hatred and resentment, made him increasingly dangerous. And though the inhabitants of the Salazar mansion still knew nothing of his existence, Carolina's past was about to explode into their lives in a way none of them could have foreseen. Afternoon light filled the Salazar mansion's main hall, illuminating the piano that had become the epicenter of the most meaningful moments between Isabella and Lucia. The notes of a melody flowed slowly under Isabella's patient guidance as she watched Lucia's progress with a gentle, constant smile. The girl, her brow slightly furrowed in concentration, seemed to absorb every instruction, as if music were a language she'd been waiting to learn. As Lucia played, her voice rose casually, as if sharing any ordinary thought. "My mum used to sing me this song before I fell asleep. She always said it was the same one you played when you were a girl." Isabella's hands froze on the keys, caught in a moment that seemed to stretch infinitely. Her breath caught in her chest, and the echo of Lucia's words thundered in her mind. "My mum, the same one you played when you were a girl. How do you know that?" Isabella asked, her voice trembling between disbelief and hope. Her eyes locked onto Lucia's, searching for something in her face that could explain what she'd just heard. Lucia, surprised by the intensity of Isabella's reaction, lowered her gaze and tapped lightly on the piano keys. "She always talked about you," she responded softly. "She said you played beautifully. That music always made her feel happy." Lucia's words fell upon Isabella like an avalanche, uncovering memories she had kept buried for years. The melody they were playing wasn't just any piece. It was one Isabella had taught Carolina as a girl, a tune that had become a symbol of their bond before everything fell apart. "Your mum spoke of me," Isabella managed to ask, her voice barely a whisper. Inside her, a war of emotions raged: joy, pain, hope, and fear. Lucia nodded slowly. "Sometimes. Not often, but she said you were special, that you had a talent no one else had." Isabella leaned back in her wheelchair, her hands falling gently into her lap. Her mind filled with memories, images of Carolina practicing that same melody, her youthful laughter filling the hall as she stumbled over the notes. The connection was too profound to ignore, yet Isabella desperately tried to rationalize what she had heard. Could it truly be possible that this girl was connected to her lost daughter? "What was your mom like?" Isabella asked carefully, wanting to know more but fearing the answers. Lucia frowned slightly, as if trying to remember. "She was beautiful," she said after a moment. "She always told me music was important, that it connected us to the people we love." Isabella felt her eyes fill with tears, but she quickly blinked them back. She didn't want to frighten Lucia or reveal the storm of emotions engulfing her. "Your mom was right," she answered with a trembling smile. "Music connects everything." That night, Isabella could not sleep. She remained awake in her room, allowing the memories of Carolina to flood her mind. Every gesture, every word from Lucia seemed to bring her daughter back in a way she could not explain. The coincidences were too many. Isabella knew she couldn't ignore what was happening. The possibility that Lucia was more than just a lost girl was a thought she could not push away. Yet the fear of raising false hopes and facing the truth kept her on edge. What if her suspicions were unfounded? What if she was clinging to an impossible hope? Despite her doubts, Isabella decided to remain silent for now. She wanted more proof, something to confirm what her heart was already starting to believe. Until then, she would treasure every moment with Lucia, every note played on the piano, every word that reminded her of Carolina. Because if Lucia truly was the connection she had lost with her daughter, Isabella knew she had arrived to heal something that had been broken for far too long. The roar of Charles Salazar's sports car echoed along the cobblestone path leading to the mansion. After several days away, immersed in endless meetings and tense negotiations, He was exhausted, but could not help feeling a slight relief at returning home. Yet as soon as he passed through the towering iron gates, something hit him. The atmosphere in the house was different. Something had changed. Upon entering the foyer, an unfamiliar sound caught his attention. Laughter. It came from the main hall, where the once silent piano seemed to have come alive. Frowning, Charles set his briefcase down beside the staircase and followed the sound. From the doorway, he stopped at the scene before him. Isabella, his mother, was seated by the piano, guiding Lucia's hands over the keys as they shared a melody. Isabella wore a broad smile, her face lit by a joy Charles hadn't seen in years. The girl, absorbed in the notes and Isabella's instructions, laughed softly each time she made a mistake, while her teacher corrected her patiently. Charles stood still, astonished. When was the last time he had seen his mother like this? For years, Isabella had been shrouded in melancholy, confined to her wheelchair, and reluctant to engage in anything not strictly necessary. And now here she was, truly alive, teaching music and laughing as if the years of pain had never existed. "Seems someone has adapted rather quickly," commented Charles from the doorway, his dry tone interrupting the moment. Isabella looked up, surprised to see him, but remained calm. "Charles," she said softly, "Lucia is a special child. She's brought something I thought I had lost forever." Charles didn't reply immediately. His eyes fixed on the girl, who stared at the floor, seemingly intimidated by his presence. There was something about her that felt familiar, though he couldn't pinpoint exactly what it was. A mix of curiosity and discomfort stirred within him, and although he recognized the positive effect Lucia had on his mother, he couldn't shake a persistent feeling of unease. During dinner, that feeling only grew. Isabella, who normally stayed quiet, was active in the conversation, asking for details about Charles's trip and sharing small moments from her day. Marta, on the other hand, seemed more reserved than usual, and Jacob, the ever-rigid butler, avoided meeting Lucia's gaze. Charles noticed these subtle yet significant changes and could not help feeling that there was something they weren't telling him. As for Lucia, she behaved impeccably. She answered politely when spoken to, but mostly remained silent, watching everyone around her with an expression that hovered between curiosity and caution. After dinner, while the rest of the household prepared to rest, Charles withdrew to his study, but his mind was far from the documents and emails waiting for him. Who was Lucia, really? Although he hadn't allowed himself much interaction with the girl, it was clear that her presence had stirred something deep within his mother, and, in some way, within him as well. The memory of the scene at the piano returned again and again. The familiarity he felt looking at Lucia wasn't something he could easily ignore. There was something in her gestures, the way she moved and spoke, that awakened in Charles an unease he couldn't comprehend. That night, as the lamplight cast shadows on the study walls, Charles made a decision. He needed to find out more about Lucia. His instincts told him that the girl was not simply a coincidence in their lives. Something bigger was going on, and he needed to understand it before it was too late. The next morning at the Salazar mansion was marked by palpable tension. Charles, who had spent the night torn between his intuitions and doubts, summoned Marta to his office in a tone that allowed no delay. The nurse arrived quickly, but her expression revealed that she sensed the purpose behind his call. "Sit," Charles ordered, indicating the chair in front of his desk. Marta complied silently, avoiding his gaze. Charles rested his elbows on the desk, fingers interlaced before his face. "I know you're keeping something from me about that girl. Tell me the truth." Charles's direct, authoritative tone was a wall Marta could not slip around. For a few seconds, she hesitated, torn between loyalty to Isabella and her duty to Charles, who ultimately held the final say in the house. But the intensity in Charles's eyes left no room for evasions. With a heavy sigh, Marta opened the folder she'd brought, removed a carefully folded document, and placed it in front of Charles. It was Lucia's birth certificate. "This confirms what I've suspected for days," she said quietly. "Lucia is Carolina's daughter." Charles remained silent, motionless as if time had stopped. His hands moved slowly toward the document, unfolding it with care, almost fearing what he would read. His gaze moved over the lines of the certificate, stopping at his sister's name under the mother heading. "This can't be true," he finally murmured, his voice barely audible. He leaned back in his chair, letting the document fall onto the desk, as if it were a burden he could no longer bear. Memories of Carolina struck him hard. The arguments, the pleas for her not to leave, the letter she left behind when she ran away, and then the emptiness of years of silence, the pain he never fully understood or processed. Marta, seeing the impact the truth had on Charles, tried to calm him. "I don't think Lucia knows the whole truth. She seems to have been searching for her place in the world, but it's clear she doesn't understand the magnitude of who she is. This isn't her fault." Charles looked up at Marta, and for a moment his face showed more than disbelief. It showed betrayal. "And you? How long have you known this? Why didn't you tell me before?" Marta swallowed hard, uncomfortable under the intensity of his gaze. "I wasn't sure at first. I just wanted to confirm my suspicions before telling you or Isabella. I knew this would change everything." "Of course it changes everything," Charles exclaimed, standing up abruptly. His voice was a mix of anger and frustration. "Carolina abandoned us. She left, knowing what that would mean for all of us. And now her daughter appears out of nowhere. And you expect me to accept this as if it were normal. How do I know this isn't some coincidence orchestrated by someone?" The resentment he felt toward his sister, buried for years, resurfaced, charged with pain. Carolina had left a void in the family that Charles had tried to fill by supporting his mother and maintaining the family empire. But he never overcame the sense of failure. Marta, maintaining her composure despite the emotional storm she saw in Charles, insisted, "Lucia has no bad intentions. She's just a child, Charles. She's here because she had nowhere else to go. If anyone needs answers, it's us, not her." Charles took a deep breath, trying to regain control. Marta's words made sense, but did not reduce the intensity of his emotions. Finally, he sat down again, running a hand over his face. "I'm going to watch her," he said after a long silence. "Before I make any decisions, I need to understand who she really is and what she wants." Marta nodded cautiously. She knew she hadn't fully convinced Charles, but at least she had taken the first step for him to face the truth. As she left the study, she left Charles deep in thought, the birth certificate still on the desk as irrefutable proof of a bond he could no longer ignore. In the silence of his study, Charles looked once more at the document. The girl who had brought a spark of life back to his mother was no stranger. She was a fragment of the past he had buried, a reminder that Carolina's legacy hadn't fully vanished. But now that the truth lay on the table, what would he do with it? In a grim neighborhood at the city's outskirts, Rodrigo lit a cigarette as his gaze lingered on a map spread across a worn table. A clear mark, a circle around a specific point, stood out on the paper: the Salazar mansion. After weeks of research and persistence, he had finally found what he was looking for. A contact at one of the local orphanages, someone willing to talk for the right price, had given him the confirmation he needed. A girl matching Lucia's description had been seen near the property weeks ago. There were no exact details, but it was enough for Rodrigo to know he was on the right track. With this information in hand, Rodrigo began planning his next move. For several days, he parked a rented vehicle at a safe distance from the mansion. Through binoculars, he watched the employees' movements, noted the gardener's routines, the cleaning staff's comings and goings, even the few visitors who arrived. Every detail mattered. His mind worked methodically, searching for the best way to approach undetected. As he observed, his hatred for the Salazars grew with each passing hour. In his mind, they were responsible for everything that had gone wrong in his life with Carolina. They had pushed her to flee. They had abandoned her when she needed them most. Rodrigo never assumed responsibility for his own actions. Instead, he had constructed a narrative where all the blame fell solely on the Salazars. During one of his stakeouts, Rodrigo let his cigarette fall and crushed it underfoot as he murmured to himself, "They won't get away with this. Lucia is my key, and I'm going to use her." The darkest side of Rodrigo began to surface as he devised his plan. He knew he would need help and contacted an old acquaintance from the underworld, a man named Cesar, who specialized in discreet, illicit jobs. In a dark, noisy tavern, Rodrigo explained his situation while Cesar listened with a cynical smile. "So, you want to get into that mansion, get the girl back, and bleed those rich folks dry," Cesar summarized, lighting a cigar. "Sounds risky, but if there's money involved, I'm in." Rodrigo nodded, his gaze fixed on Cesar. "It's not just about money, it's about revenge. They took everything from me. Now I'm going to make them pay." The two men began outlining a plan. Rodrigo knew he couldn't just barge into the mansion without raising suspicion, but he was also aware that Lucia's presence was a weak point he could exploit. He planned to approach the Salazars with the truth about Lucia and then use that information to blackmail them. If that didn't work, he wouldn't rule out more violent methods. Meanwhile, at the mansion, its residents remained unaware of the threat looming over them. However, the tension brought by Lucia's presence was increasingly evident. After the revelation of the birth certificate, Charles watched the girl with silent scrutiny, trying to reconcile fragments of the past with the present. Isabella, for her part, remained immersed in the emotional bond she had developed with Lucia, never suspecting that someone lurked in the shadows. Still, small details began to surface, hinting that something was amiss. A gardener mentioned seeing a suspicious car parked near the back entrance several days in a row. Marta noticed that one of the exterior door locks seemed to have been tampered with, though there were no signs of forced entry. The threat posed by Rodrigo was a specter drawing closer, although the mansion's inhabitants could not yet see it. Fueled by hatred and ambition, Rodrigo was about to unleash a storm that would test the Salazar family as never before. This time, Lucia's presence would not only be a link to the past, but also the catalyst for imminent danger. The following day, inside the mansion, in the dimness of her room, Isabella Salazar held a letter in her trembling hands. The envelope, yellowed by time, bore Carolina's name in the upper corner, written in her lost daughter's unmistakable handwriting. This letter was one of the many Lucia had found in the study, but for Isabella, each missive was an echo of the past she had avoided facing for years. With her heart pounding, Isabella finally decided to open it. She had spent too long hiding her pain, too many years running from memories of Carolina. With a deep sigh, she slid her fingers along the paper, unfolding it to read. "Mum, I know you have no reason to forgive me, but I need you to know that I have always loved you. I was wrong to run away and leave you all, but I was also wrong to remain silent when I needed help the most. Now I have a daughter, Lucia, and I want her to know the kindness and strength you always represented to me. I hope that one day we can talk and heal together." The words struck Isabella like a wave. She felt her breath escape as she read, tears welling up in her eyes and soon falling onto the paper. For years, she had assumed Carolina left without looking back, without any intention of returning. But this letter, written from a place of regret and love, was undeniable proof that her daughter had always wanted to come home, even in her darkest moments. Isabella dropped the letter and buried her face in her hands, unable to contain her sobs. The weight of her emotions was overwhelming, the pain of losing Carolina, the guilt for not having read the letters sooner, for not having tried to search beyond what was obvious. But alongside that pain, she felt something else, a spark of determination. Lucia, that sweet, innocent girl now running through the gardens, was not just a stranger who had arrived at her door. She was a piece of Carolina, a direct link to the daughter she had lost. And this time, Isabella would not allow history to repeat itself. She would protect Lucia as she hadn't been able to protect Carolina. She would do everything possible to ensure the girl had a home, love, and safety. Wiping away her tears, Isabella placed the letter on the table with the others Lucia had found. Her resolve was clear. It was time to speak with Charles. That night, as the mansion settled into its usual silence, Isabella asked Jacob to fetch Charles. The butler found him in his study, reviewing documents with a focus broken only by the solemn tone of Jacob's voice. "Your mother wishes to speak with you. It's important." When Charles arrived at Isabella's room, he noticed the intensity in his mother's eyes, a mixture of emotions he couldn't quite decipher. "Mum, what's going on?" he asked, taking a seat in front of her. Isabella, hands clasped in her lap, looked at him steadily before speaking. "I've read one of Carolina's letters," she began, her voice firm despite the evident emotion. "For the first time, after so many years, I decided to face what I had been avoiding." Charles frowned, surprised. "What did it say?" Isabella took a deep breath and continued. "It said she always wanted to come back, Charles, that she regretted leaving us, but didn't know how to return. And it said something else." Isabella paused, letting her words carry weight. "She talked about Lucia. Carolina had a daughter, her daughter, our granddaughter." The words hung in the air like thunder. Charles, though he had already seen the birth certificate, felt reality strike him again, this time with greater force. "Mum," he began, but Isabella interrupted him. "Lucia is part of this family, Charles. I've known it since I saw her at the piano, since she played those melodies only Carolina knew. I don't know how we got to this point, but now I know we have the responsibility to protect her, to give her what we couldn't give Carolina." Charles looked at his mother, seeing in her a resolve he hadn't seen in years. For the first time, the sadness that had always enveloped Isabella seemed to have lifted, replaced by a renewed strength. Though his mind still struggled with the idea, he couldn't help feeling that perhaps his mother was right. "If Lucia is our family," he finally said, his voice softer, "then we must do whatever is necessary to keep her safe." Isabella nodded, her eyes shining with a mixture of pain and hope. It's the only thing Carolina would have wanted. In that room, amid the shadows of their past, Isabella and Charles found a moment of unity, a first step toward healing wounds they had carried for so long. But both knew the road ahead would not be easy. Lucia's presence had brought more than just answers. It had also awakened ghosts and dangers yet to be faced. Night fell heavily over the Salazar mansion, covering the surroundings with a dense fog that barely allowed a glimpse of the imposing front gates. The cold air felt motionless, as if even nature were holding its breath. In that oppressive silence, Rodrigo was ready to carry out his plan. He had spent weeks watching every corner of the property, noting the staff's movements and spotting security weaknesses. Now, with the help of a contact, he had managed to neutralize the perimeter cameras and enter the grounds undetected. From the shadows, Rodrigo moved stealthily. Dressed in black, with methodical, calculated steps, he crept toward a rear window he knew was closed, but unlatched. With a tool he had brought, he forced it open in a matter of seconds. A soft creak broke the silence, but its echo was lost in the mansion's vastness. Rodrigo slipped inside, moving like a predator on enemy territory. His goal was clear: to take Lucia back, not out of love or responsibility, but to use her as a pawn in his plan to blackmail Charles and the rest of the Salazars. His mind was set on money, on revenge. This was his chance to claim what he felt was rightfully his. Inside the mansion, tension was palpable. Isabella, still processing the letter she had read, was trying to talk to Charles in the library. Though both shared the same goal of protecting Lucia, the way they faced the situation was weighed down by conflicting emotions. "We need to do something, Charles," Isabella insisted, her tone firm but worried. We can't just wait for things to fix themselves. Charles, seated near the fireplace, ran a hand over his face, visibly tired. I know, Mom, but it's not that simple. This situation, everything related to Carolina and Lucia, it's a lot to take in. Before Isabella could reply, a soft but unusual sound came from the hallway. Both paused for a moment, then dismissed it, assuming it was part of the house's nightly routines. However, that noise was Rodrigo, moving silently toward Lucia's room. The girl slept soundly in her bed, surrounded by the blankets Marta had carefully arranged. The room was quiet, with faint moonlight filtering through the curtains. Rodrigo, upon arriving, opened the door slowly, ensuring it did not squeak. Once inside, he observed Lucia for a moment, his face hardened by a mix of contempt and feigned sweetness. He leaned toward her, murmuring in a low, purposeful voice, "Come on, Lucia. It's time to go. Daddy's here." Lucia, upon hearing the voice, opened her eyes suddenly. Her initial confusion quickly turned into fear as she recognized him. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling. Rodrigo placed a hand over her mouth to silence her, his dark eyes fixed on her. "Don't make a sound," he said threateningly. "If you scream, things will get much worse for you." Terrified, Lucia nodded, tears rolling down her cheeks. Rodrigo forced her to get up and, without wasting any time, led her out of the room. Meanwhile, Marta, who always made nighttime rounds to ensure everyone was comfortable, came to Lucia's room. Seeing the empty bed, her heart skipped a beat. "Lucia," she called, hoping the girl was simply somewhere else. However, the silence that greeted her indicated something was terribly wrong. Quickly, Marta raised the alarm, running to the library where Charles and Isabella were. "Lucia isn't in her room," she exclaimed, panic in her voice. Charles stood up at once, his eyes reflecting a mix of alarm and fury. "What do you mean she's not there?" "The bed is empty. The window's open." Marta paused, her voice breaking. "I think someone's taken her." Wasting no time, Charles and Isabella rushed to Lucia's room. The open window and footprints on the floor confirmed what Marta feared. Someone had infiltrated the mansion. Isabella placed a hand on her chest, struggling to contain her panic, while Charles, frowning, inspected the area. "It was Rodrigo," Charles said finally, his voice cold but determined. "I knew it. I knew he wouldn't stay away." "What are we going to do?" asked Isabella, tears filling her eyes. "We'll find him," Charles replied, clenching his fists. "I won't allow that man to take Lucia. She's part of this family, and I refuse to lose her too." The night, which had begun peacefully, had turned into a nightmare. As Rodrigo fled with Lucia, the danger lurking over the Salazars had fully manifested. Now the family was locked in a race against time to rescue the girl who had brought light into their lives and to confront the man who represented the darkest parts of their past. The battle had only just begun. Rodrigo drove along a desolate road on the outskirts of the city, Lucia in the back seat of his battered vehicle. The girl remained silent, her body curled up and trembling as she tried to hold back her tears. Rodrigo, his face tense and his eyes fixed on the road, showed no trace of compassion. His mind was focused on the next step of his plan. They finally arrived at an abandoned house, a place forgotten by time, with broken windows and walls covered in graffiti. Rodrigo yanked Lucia from the car, holding her tightly by the arm, and led her inside. "We'll be safe here, little one," he said, with a falsely sweet tone that only intensified Lucia's fear. Inside, Rodrigo rummaged through the girl's pockets until he found her mobile phone. He sat down on a rickety chair and dialed a number he had memorized, Charles Salazar's number. As he waited for an answer, Rodrigo smiled with satisfaction. Everything was going according to plan. At the mansion, Charles paced back and forth in his study, his mind racing to come up with a plan. The ring of his phone shattered the silence, and when he saw Lucia's name on the screen, He felt his stomach drop. He answered immediately. "Lucia," he said urgently, but the voice that replied was not the girl's. "Hello, Charles," said Rodrigo, his tone cold and calculating. "If you ever want to see your niece again, you'd better listen closely." Charles gritted his teeth, his anger mixing with a growing sense of guilt. "What do you want?" Rodrigo laughed softly, as if the answer were obvious. "Money, of course. A substantial sum for the safe return of your dear niece. And don't even think about calling the police. If you do, I promise, you'll never see her again." Charles closed his eyes, trying to keep his anger in check. "All right," he said, forcing himself to remain calm. "I'll do whatever is necessary. But if you harm Lucia, there won't be a place in the world where you can hide from me." Rodrigo ignored the threat, pleased with Charles's reply. "I knew you'd understand. I'll give you instructions soon. Until then, make sure you're ready to pay." The call ended, leaving Charles with the phone in his hand and a storm of emotions raging inside him. This was his fault. He had allowed Rodrigo to get too close. In another part of the house, Isabella waited impatiently for Charles. When he finally entered the room, his face reflected worry and determination. "What did he say?" she asked anxiously. "He wants money," Charles answered somberly. "He warned us not to call the police." Isabella nodded, but her eyes showed more than fear. "I'm going to help you," she declared, her voice firm. "She's my granddaughter, Charles. I won't stay here while that man endangers her life." Charles frowned, his instinct to protect Isabella kicking in. "Mum, you can't get involved. It's dangerous." "What do you expect me to do?" Isabella replied, raising her voice. "Carolina left because I wasn't there to protect her. I won't make the same mistake with Lucia, not this time." Charles saw the determination in his mother's eyes and knew there was no point arguing. Isabella was resolved, and her conviction only reinforced the need to act quickly. Charles gathered Marta and Jacob in his study. He explained the situation quickly and clearly, not hiding the risks. Both nodded, making it clear they were willing to help. With Charles's network of contacts and the family's resources, they began tracing Rodrigo's whereabouts. Marta, who had access to certain records and systems, used the last signal from Lucia's phone to narrow down the search area. Jacob, with his knowledge of the mansion's staff and suppliers, recalled a couple of names who might have been Rodrigo's contacts. Charles, meanwhile, prepared the money Rodrigo demanded, knowing it was unlikely the transaction would end as simply as the man suggested. "This is nothing but a distraction," said Charles, as he placed the bills into a suitcase. "We need to make sure we can find Lucia before he tries to disappear." Isabella, though not directly involved in the logistics, watched attentively, offering words of encouragement when needed. Her presence, far from being a burden, seemed to infuse everyone with a renewed sense of purpose. It was clear that, for the first time in a long while, the Salazar family was united in a common goal: to bring Lucia back safely. Tension in the mansion was palpable as the night wore on. Although Rodrigo believed he had control of the situation, Charles and his team worked tirelessly to stay one step ahead. Rescuing Lucia would not be a simple exchange of money. It would be a battle that would define the Salazar family's future. And this time, Charles was determined to win. The night was dark and cold as Charles drove toward the abandoned house. On the passenger seat rested a suitcase full of money, carefully prepared to meet Rodrigo's demands, though Charles knew money was only part of the problem. His mind was focused, his muscles tense, but behind his calm facade, a whirlwind of emotions consumed him. Isabella and Marta followed in a second vehicle, parking some distance from the site. Hidden in the shadow of some trees, both waited, ready to act if necessary. Isabella, wrapped in a coat that couldn't shield her from the cold night, watched the entrance with a mix of fear and determination. "Are you sure about this, Isabella?" Marta asked, noticing the tremor in her hands. "Lucia is my granddaughter," Isabella replied firmly. "I'd do anything for her." Charles entered the abandoned house with resolute steps, holding the suitcase in one hand as his eyes scanned the space. The place lay in ruins, with broken windows and graffiti-covered walls. In the center of the main room, Rodrigo waited with a crooked smile, his arrogance evident in every gesture. "I knew you'd come," said Rodrigo, leaning against a rickety table. "A Salazar, always ready to protect his precious family." Charles clenched his jaw, but remained calm. His eyes darted to Lucia, who was tied to a chair in the corner. Her face was pale, tear stains on her cheeks, but her eyes shone with a glimmer of hope upon seeing Charles. "Let her go, Rodrigo," said Charles, his voice firm yet contained. "You have what you want. The money is here." Rodrigo folded his arms, savoring the moment. "Is that what you think?" he said with a sarcastic laugh. "This isn't just about money. I want to see you suffer, just like I suffered when your family destroyed Carolina. You had it all, and yet you abandoned her. Now I'm in control." Charles stepped forward, his stance defiant. "What happened with Carolina was a mistake I've never stopped regretting. But what you're doing won't bring her back." Rodrigo didn't respond immediately. His eyes flashed with rage, but before he could reply, a subtle noise from the back of the house momentarily distracted him. Isabella and Marta had found a back entrance. Moving carefully, they slipped inside and advanced down a dark hallway toward the source of the voices. When they finally reached the main room, Isabella halted at the sight of Rodrigo, more threatening than she had imagined. But when her eyes met Lucia's, she knew she could not turn back. "Rodrigo!" called Isabella from the doorway, her voice strong and clear. The man turned, surprised to see the Salazar matriarch standing before him. "Carolina loved you," Isabella continued, advancing slowly. "But you destroyed her. You manipulated her, isolated her, and now you want to do the same with her daughter. I won't allow it." Rodrigo stood momentarily frozen, unsettled by Isabella's unexpected courage. That pause was all Charles needed. With a swift movement, he lunged at Rodrigo, knocking him to the floor. The money-filled suitcase fell, its contents scattering across the dusty floor. The struggle between the two men was intense, both fighting for control. Rodrigo, desperate, tried to reach a knife hidden in his belt, but Charles immobilized him with an arm lock, using all his strength to keep him pinned down. Meanwhile, Marta ran to Lucia and loosened the ropes binding her. "It's okay, sweetheart. You're safe now," she said, as the girl clung to her tightly. Rodrigo, his face red with effort, tried to break free, but the sound of distant sirens made him stop. The police, alerted by Jacob from the mansion, arrived just in time. 2 officers entered the house with drawn weapons, ordering Rodrigo to stay on the ground. "This isn't over, Salazar," growled Rodrigo as he was handcuffed. "You'll pay for this." Charles, panting from the effort, watched as they led Rodrigo away. "You won't get another chance to hurt my family." With Rodrigo in custody, Charles turned to Lucia, who ran toward him. The girl hugged him tightly, and for the first time in a long time, Charles felt something inside him fall into place. "It's all right now," he whispered, holding her. "I promise I'll never let anyone hurt you again." Isabella approached slowly, her gaze soft as she looked at her granddaughter, safe at last. Marta, tears in her eyes, also joined them, certain that, though the battle had been hard, the Salazar family had proven their strength lay in their unity. The night ended with a new beginning. Though the scars of the past remained, there was hope for the future. The family was more united than ever, and Lucia, the link between past and present, became the symbol of their renewal. Together, they could face any storm. The tension in the abandoned house was palpable, almost suffocating. In the center of the disordered living room, Charles stood face to face with Rodrigo, whose firm hand held a knife glinting under the dim light of a lone lamp. Lucia, terrified, sat against a nearby wall, tears running down her cheeks. Her eyes begged for help, but not a sound escaped her lips. Isabella, from a hidden corner near the entrance, watched the scene with her heart hammering in her chest. Every movement of Rodrigo, every word from Charles, kept her on the edge of panic. Everything depended on the next few minutes. "Rodrigo, it doesn't have to end this way," said Charles, his voice calm but charged with firmness. He took a step forward, hands raised in a gesture of apparent surrender. "You have the money. Let her go. Nobody has to get hurt." Rodrigo let out a bitter laugh, his dark eyes reflecting a hatred nurtured over years. "You think you can buy everything, Charles. Always so confident, so sure money fixes everything." He raised the knife slightly, pointing it toward Charles. "Your family took Carolina from me, destroyed her, and now you want to take my daughter." "She's not your daughter, Rodrigo," Charles replied, his tone hardening. "Lucia deserves better than being a tool in your game of revenge. You can't use her to make up for your mistakes." The conversation intensified, the danger lurking in every word. Charles felt time slipping away. Rodrigo refused to reason, blinded by hate and his own demons. With quick calculation, Charles decided to take a risk. Suddenly, he tossed the suitcase of money at Rodrigo's feet. The sound of the bills and the impact against the floor distracted Rodrigo for an instant, long enough for Charles to launch himself at him. The clash was violent. Charles struck Rodrigo with all his strength, and both fell to the ground. The knife slipped among the debris, but Rodrigo did not give up easily. They grappled, knocking over furniture and scattering boxes as they fought. Though physically weaker, Rodrigo fought with the desperation of a cornered animal. From her hiding place, Isabella held her breath. Every sound, every movement, kept her in suspense. Her instincts urged her to intervene, but she knew doing so would only make matters worse. Her only hope was that Charles would gain control. Lucia, still in her corner, watched with wide eyes. Though she remained frightened, something in Charles's bravery gave her the strength not to completely fall apart. Meanwhile, Marta, who had gone to seek help, arrived with the police just in time. The officers burst into the house, their voices filling the space as they ordered Rodrigo to stop. Seeing their weapons aimed at him, Rodrigo finally ceased to resist. The officers swiftly handcuffed him, ensuring he could cause no more harm. Lucia ran to Isabella the moment she realized the immediate danger had passed. She hugged her tightly, crying into her chest while Isabella, tears in her eyes, held her in her arms. "It's all right now, my dear," she whispered, trying to comfort her. "I'm here. You're safe." Charles, bruised but unhurt, straightened up, breathing heavily as he watched the officers escort Rodrigo out of the house. The man's face held a mixture of defeat and contained rage. Before being put into the police car, Rodrigo turned toward Charles, a crooked smile on his lips. "This isn't over, Salazar," he said threateningly. But Charles did not reply. His attention was no longer on Rodrigo. He had accomplished what truly mattered, protecting Lucia and keeping his family united. With Rodrigo finally in custody, calm began to return, though the weight of the experience still hung over them all. Charles approached Isabella and Lucia, kneeling in front of the girl. "Are you all right?" he asked softly, placing a hand on her shoulder. Lucia nodded weakly before throwing herself into his arms. Charles hugged her tightly, feeling that, for the first time in a long while, something inside him was easing. While the police secured the area and began gathering evidence, Charles, Isabella, and Marta prepared to return to the mansion. They had faced real danger, but had overcome it together. And although the wounds of the past remained open, this night marked a turning point. At last, they had a chance to heal and build something new. The battle was over, but their family's reconstruction had only just begun. The air in the Salazar mansion had changed. The tension and fear that had shrouded the family for weeks were now giving way to palpable relief, though still tinged with reflection. After Rodrigo's arrest, the return to the mansion was quiet, each member lost in their own thoughts. Yet there was something new in the atmosphere: hope. As Charles crossed the foyer, He paused for a moment before the family portrait hanging on the main wall. It was an old image from when Carolina still lived in the mansion. For the first time in a long while, instead of feeling guilt, he felt the need to honor her memory by doing the right thing for Lucia. Later that night, in the tranquility of Isabella's study, Charles sat across from his mother for a conversation he had been postponing. "Lucia shouldn't just be a guest in this house," Charles began, his tone serious but full of resolve. "She deserves to be part of this family. Officially." Isabella, seated in her wheelchair, nodded slowly. "I've been thinking the same thing," she said, her voice gentle but laden with emotion. "We can't change what happened with Carolina, but we can give Lucia the home she needs, and that includes giving her our surname." With that agreement, the Salazars embarked on a new journey, the process of adopting Lucia. Though bureaucratically complicated, Charles used all the resources at his disposal to ensure the process advanced without setbacks. It was his way of proving he was willing to do whatever was necessary to right the wrongs of the past. The adoption ceremony took place in the mansion's main hall. It was a simple event, but full of meaning. Isabella, tears of pride in her eyes, signed the documents as a witness alongside Marta and Jacob. Lucia, still processing everything that had happened, smiled timidly when Charles knelt beside her and reassured her, "You're a Salazar now. You always will be." Making Lucia officially part of the family was a transformative moment, not only for the girl but also for Isabella and Charles. For the first time, they felt they were closing a wound that had remained open for years. As Lucia adapted to her new place in the family, Isabella made an important decision. Inspired by the energy and joy Lucia had brought to her life, she decided to begin intensive physical rehabilitation. She wanted to regain some of her independence, not just for herself, but to be an active grandmother for her granddaughter. The sessions were exhausting at first, but Isabella faced the challenge with renewed determination. Lucia, always nearby, encouraged her with small gestures. Notes of support, melodies on the piano that Isabella had taught her, and even accompanying her during her exercises. This connection strengthened their bond even more. In the following days, the relationship between Isabella and Lucia blossomed in unexpected ways. The two spent hours together in the music room, playing the piano and sharing stories. Isabella, who had once avoided speaking of the past, began to open up, telling Lucia anecdotes about Carolina, her laughter, her love of music, and the happy moments they shared before life took a dark turn. For Lucia, these conversations filled the void her mother had left behind. Each story brought her closer to the woman she barely remembered, and each melody they played together seemed to bring a small part of Carolina back to life. For Isabella, these moments were an opportunity for redemption, a way to mend past mistakes and build a positive legacy for her family. Over time, the Salazar mansion, once a place of isolation and pain, transformed into a home filled with laughter and music. Lucia, with her resilient spirit, had ignited a spark that ushered in a new chapter for the family. And though the scars of the past remained, there was a shared feeling among them all. A new beginning was possible. Seated at the piano with Lucia one afternoon, Isabella watched as the girl played a simple yet moving melody. "Your mother would be so proud of you," she said, her voice charged with emotion. Lucia looked up and smiled. "I think she'd be happy to see us together," she replied, with a maturity that deeply moved Isabella. In that moment, bathed in the golden light of the setting sun filtering through the windows, Isabella knew that despite everything, the Salazar family had found a new way to heal and move forward. Lucia was not only her granddaughter, she was the bridge between the past and a future full of possibilities. Charles Salazar had always lived by one premise: work first, everything else later. For years, his life revolved around his hotel empire, leaving little room for personal relationships or introspection. But recent events had changed something profound within him. Lucia's arrival and the ordeal with Rodrigo forced him to re-evaluate what truly mattered. On a sunny morning, seated in his office, Charles reviewed a stack of documents that had piled up over days. However, this time he did not feel the usual urgency that accompanied these tasks. His thoughts drifted constantly toward the image of Lucia, Isabella, and even memories of Carolina. The truth was clear. He had spent too long prioritizing financial success at the expense of personal connections. With a sigh, Charles made a decision he had been putting off. That very afternoon, he convened a meeting with his company's executives. "I'm going to delegate much of my responsibilities," he announced. Surprised looks did not intimidate him. "It's time I spend more time with my family. I trust you to handle the day-to-day." Though the decision was difficult, Charles felt a weight lift from his shoulders. For the first time, he had chosen the personal over the professional. Immediate changes took place in the Salazar mansion. Charles began to involve himself more in daily family life, especially with Lucia. At first, his attempts were awkward. He wasn't used to being a paternal figure. But gradually, with patience and perseverance, he found his way. He helped Lucia with her homework, showing her techniques to solve math problems or explaining historical concepts that puzzled her. In the afternoons, he accompanied her on walks through the garden, listening to her stories and endless questions. Despite the differences in age and experience, a connection began to form between them. One day, as they strolled through the park, Lucia picked up a leaf from the ground and held it up to the light, admiring its color and texture. "Did you know each leaf is unique, like people?" she commented with her typical curiosity. Charles smiled. "So I've heard, though sometimes it takes people a while to realize what makes them special." Lucia looked at him with a gentle smile. "I think you're special, even if you don't always know it." That innocent yet meaningful comment led Charles to open up in a way he never had before. Walking beside her, he decided to share something he had kept inside for years. "You know, I've always felt guilty about what happened with your mom," he confessed, his voice low but full of emotion. "Carolina and we argued a lot before she left. I never fully understood her. And when she went away, I felt I had failed, that I hadn't done enough to make her stay." Lucia stopped and looked at him with her large eyes, showing a maturity beyond her years. "My mom always spoke of you as her hero," she said softly. "She said you were strong and always tried to protect the family. Maybe you couldn't save her, but you saved me." Lucia's words struck Charles like a wave of relief and healing. For the first time, he felt the guilt he had carried for years begin to dissipate. He had done what he could in the past, but now he had a real chance to do things right in the present. Back at the mansion, Charles felt a lightness he hadn't experienced in years. His relationship with Lucia, although still developing, was already a genuine bond, a connection that filled him with purpose. That night, during family dinner, Isabella noticed the change in her son. "You look calmer, Charles," she commented with a smile. "It's because I finally understand what truly matters," he replied, looking at Lucia with pride. "And I won't lose sight of it." Lucia, seated beside him, returned his smile before focusing on her plate. It was a simple gesture, but for Charles, it meant everything. In the warm silence of that family evening, Charles knew he had found something financial success could never give him: peace with himself and the joy of a united family. The Salazar mansion, once a place wrapped in shadows and silence, began to transform into something completely different. Where coldness once reigned, now laughter and music filled the halls. The change wasn't immediate, but over time, every corner of the house began to reflect the new spirit Lucia had brought with her. Marta, who had always been a maternal figure to Isabella, found in Lucia an opportunity to express her care in a new way. With patience and kindness, she helped the girl adapt to her new life, teaching her practical things like organizing her room and sharing little tricks to navigate confidently through the enormous mansion. Marta became a guide and a constant support, a pillar in Lucia's adjustment process. Even Jacob, the rigid and disciplined butler, began to soften. Although at first his distant attitude seemed unyielding, Lucia's natural gestures and curiosity managed to break that barrier. One day, finding her examining the greenhouse plants, Jacob, with a mix of resignation and tenderness, showed her how to care for the orchids, his personal pride. Soon, the two developed a routine. Lucia accompanied him on visits to the greenhouse, and he taught her the names of the flowers and how to tend them. The general atmosphere in the mansion also underwent a notable change. Inspired by Lucia's presence and youthful energy, Isabella decided to reopen the doors of the house to her close friends. She organized small gatherings, something she hadn't done since before her accident. The dinners and get-togethers were simple but warm, full of lively conversations and laughter that seemed to revitalize her. Charles, though still reserved by nature, began to participate actively in these gatherings. At first, he took on more of an observer's role, but gradually he got more involved, sharing anecdotes and laughter with the guests. The connection he had developed with Lucia had made him more open, and this reflected in his attitude. For the first time in years, family dinners at the Salazar mansion were moments of unity and joy. Seated around the long dining table, the family shared stories of the day, future plans, and often jokes that provoked sincere laughter. Lucia, with her spontaneity, was at the center of many of these conversations, and her presence lit up the atmosphere. One night, as they shared dessert, Isabella raised her glass and looked at each of those present with a smile full of gratitude. "I want you to know that this house, which once was a place of painful memories, is now a home again, and we owe that to Lucia." The girl, slightly embarrassed, smiled timidly, but Charles placed a hand on her shoulder, nodding proudly. "It's true," he said. "You've reminded us what it means to be a family." The mansion, which had witnessed decades of pain and distance, now vibrated with new energy. The old wounds did not vanish completely, but they were covered by a mantle of hope and renewed love. Isabella, Charles, Lucia, Marta, and Jacob, each of them had found their place in this new chapter. The house, once cold and distant, became a warm and welcoming refuge, full of life and possibility. And although the Salazar family still had a long way to go, now they were together, ready to face it as a solid unit. The past had marked their lives, but the present offered them the chance to write a different story. It was a sunny afternoon in the garden of the Salazar mansion. The place that once witnessed years of loneliness and silence now thrummed with renewed warmth. Under the shade of a large tree, Charles, Isabella, and Lucia enjoyed a moment of tranquility. The scent of flowers filled the air, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves, creating a natural symphony that complemented the peace of the moment. Lucia, her laughter contagious, sat on the grass with a portable keyboard Charles had recently given her. She played a simple but cheerful melody, with the enthusiasm of someone enjoying every note. Isabella, seated nearby, softly sang along, her voice adding a nostalgic touch to the music. Despite the marks of the years and difficulties, Isabella seemed rejuvenated, her face illuminated by a serene smile. Charles, sitting a few steps away, observed the scene with a mixture of pride and gratitude. He had spent so long chasing success and seeking answers in the past that moments like this seemed a luxury. But now, watching his mother and Lucia together, he felt a peace he could not remember experiencing before. For the first time in years, everything seemed to be in its place. Suddenly, Lucia stopped playing and jumped up with her characteristic energy. She ran toward Charles and, before he could react, hugged him tightly, wrapping her small arms around him. "Thank you for being my family," she said, her voice filled with sincere gratitude. Her eyes shone with emotion as she looked at him, her expression full of love and admiration. Charles, surprised but deeply moved, bent down and hugged her back. He said nothing, because there were no words to express what he felt in that moment. He just held her, letting the gesture speak for him. The bond they shared was genuine, built on a foundation of sacrifice, understanding, and love, born from the darkest moments. Isabella, watching from her chair, smiled, her eyes filling with tears. That instant encapsulated everything she had dreamed for her family. A home full of love and a connection that transcended the past. As the sun began to set, bathing the garden in golden and orange tones, the imaginary camera seemed to slowly pull away. It showed the Salazar family enjoying that perfect moment together under the tree, while the world around them seemed to stand still. The mansion, which once symbolized isolation and pain, now looked different under the sunset's light. Its walls were no longer cold or distant. They were now the heart of a home filled with love, hope, and new beginnings. Though the scars of the past would never fully disappear, the Salazar family had found a way to heal together. And at that moment, as Lucia's laughter echoed in the air and the music faded into the horizon, one thing was clear. This was the true meaning of home. The Salazar family's story shows us how pain, regret, and past scars can be transformed into love, redemption, and new beginnings. Each character faced their own emotional challenges. Charles with his guilt, Isabella with her loneliness, and Lucia with loss and the longing to belong. However, by facing adversity together, they found something more valuable than merely repairing mistakes. They found the opportunity to build a new life. Lucia's arrival, though unexpected, was the catalyst the family needed to confront the ghosts that had kept them apart for years. She not only brought joy into their lives, but also the ability to forgive one another and find strength in their unity. In the process, the Salazar mansion, once a symbol of isolation, became a true home where laughter and love replaced the echoes of the past. The main lesson from this story is that family is not defined solely by blood, but by love, dedication, and the ability to support each other through the darkest moments. Past mistakes need not determine our future. There is always a chance to heal, to love, and to start over. It also reminds us that human connections are the true driving force of life. No matter how much material success we achieve, without meaningful relationships, that success is meaningless. By prioritizing love and caring for others, as Charles did when he changed his priorities, we discover what truly matters. Ultimately, the Salazar story inspires us to open our hearts to forgiveness and to give second chances, because even the deepest wounds can be healed when there is love and the will to rebuild. And that's it for today's video. We hope you enjoyed it as much as we enjoyed sharing this story with you. Don't forget to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any new content. See you in the next video. Take care, and remember, there's always room for a new beginning.